linguists, but language scholars generally, because the UN made it one, and Bengal has always celebrated, if you want, or observed accouché. And partly that is some of my reason, because I think that this day has become a matter of pride where you're just supposed to demonstrate your language and your particular identity without understanding what language is about and understanding that if and what language in a democracy is about. Mother Language Day is not only about celebrating your language, it is also celebrating the fact that there exist so many of us which have different mother tongues. And somehow I find that there is a lot of interest that particularly this regime has shown in languages, and there's a kind of shrinking away from it. So giving this talk today gives me an opportunity to reflect on, I agree with the main proposition to the title, that there is something which is very different, which is happening with Indian languages now. But I want to be able to put my finger on this. So bear with me, I'm going to not going to be reading out, but I've got some stuff on this data. So some of it you must already know because you are all literate political people, but I think I will just put in a frame. So I wanted to begin by looking at two sets of figures. One from the 2011 census, the results of what are the languages that exist in, what is the census counting of languages in 2011 and 2001. So you must be aware of the census, the way the census does it. And this actually is a practice that dates back to Grierson's time, that is from 1896. Why we continue to have that practice is something that I will discuss. So the census enumerator goes to your house and asks you, what are the languages you speak? And because Grierson was interested in the Linguistic Survey of India of finding out the names of all the languages that were given, because the earlier colonial administrators didn't understand how so many names were coming. And so these are called the raw returns. Okay? So in the 2011 census, the number of language names that were returned was 19,569. That is the number of names that were returned. The census then, because, language names are, certainly in 1896 this was the case, that these language names are typically exonyms. So I'm just speaking language, particularly if I'm a monolingual. I don't have a name for it. Somebody else comes and names me, that this is the language you're speaking. So lots of people, depending on who they've encountered, who has come to talk to them or has talked about them, for the same language you can get many different names. So the census, this is Grierson's methodology, that is, okay, so now I'm going to look at these language name lists and I'm going to now rationalize them. So for example, if I'm living in Punjab and I am a Mochi, then if somebody comes and asks me this ridiculous question as to why, what language do you speak? Answer your caste name, right? But actually Mochi is just like Punjabi. So Grierson has a whole method for this. And so there's a process of rationalizing that goes on. Now the Census of India uses the same, as a reference, this 1896 document, which had some methodology for rationalization. And the list and that rationalized list, so Census of India compares it to that list. And so after rationalization, in the 2011 census gets 2,843 names. 1369 are the languages which have been identified by Grierson. Okay? And 1474 cannot be classified according to Grierson's schema. So then the Census of India does a post classification, and In this classification says that those languages that are have less than 10,000 speakers, we are just going to put them away. So 10,000 people is too little, less than 10,000 people too little, they are not even going to be called languages. And at the end of that, the Census of India 2011 gets you 270 mother tongues. Then those languages are grouped under scheduled languages. That is, there's an 8th schedule of the Constitution, which is just entitled languages. It doesn't say they are national languages or any of that. They are just called scheduled languages. So now these 270 names are then classified in terms of the scheduled languages. And so there are 22 scheduled languages. And so 123 of those 270 fall under scheduled languages, and 147 mother tongues fall under non-scheduled languages. Right? And so then after all that grouping, we get about 270 languages, and then of course they remove all that grouping, and then only the names of the scheduled languages. Closer. And after that you end up getting 140 languages, because only the names of the scheduled languages survive. Now the same methodology was followed by the 2001 census. The raw returns of languages are 10,400. So in a decade, India developed 9,000 more names. Okay, these were rationalized to 3,372 languages, out of which 1576 were classified and 1796 were unclassified. Then post-classification, we ended up with 216 mother tongues, and then the similar process, and I think it gets 2 less number of languages. So in each case, what the people of India are saying, so census enumerators, when you go, you ask them about your religion, they'll take down what you say, hopefully, right? If they ask you about your gender, whatever you answer. But on the matter of languages, there is absolutely no control that the speaker has in what they are reported. Because the belief is that, and the understanding is, which doesn't seem to be untrue, that speakers don't know the names of their languages, and they are only asking for names. Yeah. But interestingly, between the 2001 census, so you have a vanishing, if you want, if 19,000 is a real figure, you have a vanishing and a whittling down of the numbers of people who actually speak languages. So basically you start off with 19,569 names and you will end up with 114 names. And so this is an issue of where is the whittling down unfair, where is it legitimate, etc. But interestingly, it seems that the speakers of India really don't know, because the numbers of speakers per mother tongue varies wildly in every census. Right? So in the 2011 census, the number of Sanskrit speakers was let's look at the 1971 speakers. It was 2,212. These are people who claim to be mother tongue speakers of the language. So that is the language they speak in the whole. And this went up to 49,020 years later, and then came down to 24,000 years later. Either they are reproducing madly, much beyond what is biologically possible, and they are also dying at a very disproportionate rate. And this is true for many languages in the census. Sorry. So there are many questions that we can ask. But the first thing that we must note is that it's not like that the situation pre-rationalization, pre-saffronization and post-saffronization is very different. We can ask many questions. So why is it that Indians still do not know the names of their own languages they speak? And we're in the 21st century. This exercise has happened census after census. Indian languages have allegedly entered the curriculum. Why is it the case that Indians don't know what they speak? Well, one reason, and I think that's a very important reason, is that we live in such a connected world now, that there's just no public discourse or education about all the languages of India. So actually people don't name their own languages because there is no idea whatsoever that this is something which is a cultural resource. The languages that they speak, the majority of Indians speak, except for only the scheduled languages. If you remember in the census methodology, only the scheduled languages get some attention. And their languages are ignored by the state, by the education system. So the Central Institute of Indian Languages has, I think, a 2014 document which tells us that despite whatever number of mother tongues that we have ended up with even post-restaurant, a maximum of 69 different languages are taught in school. Right? Only 50%, and that's a huge stretch actually, 50% of the languages, whatever the number is, have a written form. Only 87 of the languages of India are printed. Okay. And radio programs are only in 50, and that is something that is largely controlled by the state because there is no market. And we are looking at markets of over 10,000 speakers. And of course, in our society, when we hold up India the ideas of multilingualism and the fact that we are linguistically diverse, we name the scheduled languages. Right? And others, if they enter into our universe at all, they are just there as curiosities, and they are without histories, without any social status. But there's another reason why Indians don't know the names of their languages, is because this naming, 19,000 names, is that basically you're naming as an act of political identity. So you're not naming the language as an object of knowledge, as a vehicle of culture. You're not naming the language for what it is, but whatever suits your opinion at that particular time. In the 71-81 census, the number of Sanskrit native speakers who use the language grew because there's a political movement with which there's an association. And now that Sanskrit rules all of us, allegedly. Therefore, in fact, this last decade, between 2001, there's been a fall in the number of speakers. We can also ask, why are there so many unclassified languages? And how is it that one man with very limited resources did this classification between 1896 and 1903? But since then, there has been virtually no support for India's languages. This is also particularly poignant because our constitution actually defines linguistic minorities and their rights and their right to have education in the mother tongue. All these criteria are there in the constitution. The 1890 scheme that is used is, of course, from 130 years ago, so that scheme is not very efficient. But all the scholarship and interest, and this doesn't have to be only linguists, it can be all kinds of people. There seems to be no state activity around languages. Now one can ask, why are less than 10,000 speakers not counted? And both in 2001, 2011, we see that there is a problem. Minorities continue to remain a problem of the linguistic state. And religion can identify just a few minorities. But linguistic minorities in this country are huge numbers. Right? And this is why are they not counted below 10,000? Because you have a constitution that is very strong on the protection of minorities, linguistic minorities, and allows them to set up institutions also for the propagation of their language, culture, etc. And nevertheless, we are in this situation. But there's also another question we should ask, which is, I think, lies at the root of the problems of India today, is why do we group under scheduled languages? What is the basis for that grouping? Why do I have to take a mother tongue, which I see is a different variety? So there will be perhaps in this audience speakers of Awadhi. Why should Awadhi be grouped under Hindi? Why should it be grouped? And this is got to do with the political history of our country, where under the demand for the linguistic reorganization of states, where particularly education, which was a newly nascent state, was building, the question of the maintenance of one's language, the right to participate in governance, all of those were a challenge. And from the Fifth State Reorganization Act, and I won't go into the history that produced all of this, that we created a scheme whereby these powerful subnationalisms, and please do not take it to mean that I say that these are wrong, because what the idea behind that, and it took a lot of struggle by the left particularly to demand that the reorganization be correctly done, because before it was only before independence only Uriya could demonstrate to the colonial government that we don't speak Bangla. We cannot belong in the Bengal presidency. But it's post that, the next state, the first state in independent India to be formed recognizing was Andhra. Because they said, no, how can we be part of the Madras presidency? We're distinct languages. So these were subnationalisms of this kind were based on very powerful arguments. And the idea was that these languages need to be preserved. Now that list, we started off with a list of 40. And we are at this point at the current day, the age of 22. But what this also did was privilege these subnationalisms as the means by which we are going to talk language. So when I see why I don't like celebrating today, is because when somebody says, I'm speaking Bangla today because it is, or I am speaking Mizo today, it's because you managed to get a state under your belt. But if you haven't got a state, if you are a linguistic minority within one of those states, you don't actually speak your language. And if you do also, if you utter a few phrases, you actually don't know what your language is. So the public education that is so important to keep the discourse of language under control, to keep to not let language only become the site of identity, nationalism, and all that which is the plurality, where these words, these languages of I know that there is no actually purely Urdu-speaking household in the 19th century, 20th, because the women spoke Avdi. So the colonial scheme of taking one language was, over the last 60, 70 years in India, in some sense went on into overdrive, and it's only the subnationalism that comes. Now, given this situation, what does this mean? It means that many languages, most of India's languages, are not written. Most of these India's languages are not taught. Most of Indian languages are not printed. So those stories and those aspects are completely ignored. Now, what has the Indian state done from the 50s, and which is why any document that recognizes India as a multilingual country would in principle be welcome. So what has been the state's planning activities? Everybody must have heard and suffered through the 3-language formula, which in most urban schools has become dead language plus 2 languages that you need. But the state has various categories of power, and my friend Hani Babu has written about this in EPW several years ago. that actually what the Indian state, and because language policy, education policy is on the concurrent list, that really there has been only planning of Hindi, Sanskrit and English. And what states do, because Sanskrit is a vice that you cannot remove, get rid of. English is a vice that you cannot escape from, because, of course, education is meant for going ahead. Is that they said, okay, now we add scheduled languages. So really, there you have a slightly bigger basket. Okay. So, therefore, if you get the way to actually become a language of note, or something that the rest of the Indian people become aware of, is the struggle to get into the 8th schedule. Because 8th schedule languages have quite a number of privileges. They can be used as languages of education. There has to be some government money given to those languages, because of course when your market is limited, you wanted NBT to publish them. And over the years, irrespective of what government we've had, it's this scheduled languages scheme which has strengthened the vice. So this becomes something, so India's linguistic diversity becomes something that we tout in a Facebook post or an Insta post. But we really know nothing even about our own languages. There's been an attempt, but that club has closed down, which was everybody had to become classical languages. And there's no history of India's languages ever been written. You are never taught it in school, where all the languages would be together. But there's been the classical language club. So there was the ministry, because the South was pushing back, because the Dravidian language group is smaller than the Indo-Aryan group, and there's fewer scheduled languages. And you know that in India, only a Hindi speaker can become Prime Minister. As a consequence, so classical languages became a club. Again, Oriya managed to get into it. You had to demonstrate. But it was anyway a club that didn't really get much things beyond. I think one of the rules, it says there are 2 annual international awards, one Center for Inclusion, and UGC start some department in central universities. And that's exactly what is happening in JNU today, because the only languages that are getting centers in are Tamil studies and Oriya studies. That's exactly what. So there's a scheme by which now the state will fund, but they'll have to be classical languages. 8th scheduled languages, as I said, get more extensive benefits, right? But really the official languages, because they actually have a finite sway of the various states. Now, interestingly, if you look at the list, and I think it's important as students of the contemporary politics, that if you look at the list, barring a few states, and you can guess the ideology of those states practically, it is only the 8th scheduled languages that get to be official languages of the states. So it isn't the case. So except in the Northeast, where Mizo is a state language, in Nagaland, English is a state language, in Tripura, it is Kokporo, in Manipur, it is Manipuri, but where really Hindi. But in all these states, actually there are varieties of Hindi which the state has used to basically, quote unquote, my hated word, mainstream the Northeast, right? So that the idea is that we cannot, unless we can speak to them in our language, we cannot. There's still on the instruments of the state, the very important instruments of the state. Again, these scheduled languages, scheduled languages and official languages, that their connection remains. So, for example, in the language of the courts, in principle, the governor can entertain an application and pass it on to the president for a local language to be used in the court. But in practice, the 4 states that have got the right to conduct proceedings and write judgments, right, in their own languages have been all languages that have had Hindi. as their state official language as well. And interestingly, Tamil Nadu had made an application that judgments could be written in Tamil, and that application was formally turned down around 2005. But from 2010, there's been some lawyers are being allowed to argue in Tamil. So what do we see between, so that seems like a continuous, unbroken history that where there is systematic marginalization. And the languages of the people do not find either written expression or official expression. They can still speak those languages at home, right? But they're not educated about them. So that mother tongues only become expressors of identity. They are not vehicles for self-expression and knowledge. So the phenomenon that we see in the census is a phenomenon where lots of people are claiming that they speak Santali, that they speak Bhumij. I'm sure that sitting here, there are many people who would say that they speak Maghi and Bhojpuri. But actually amongst them, in their homes, in their friends, it's actually one of the scheduled languages that has taken up the major sway, and that your domains of use. You can't use these languages anywhere. And therefore these languages. I just want you to pause for a moment and contrast. We have another history of a very diverse country, linguistically diverse country, which was a great inspiration to the freedom movement. That in post the October Revolution, Lenin was in charge. All languages, including all the Central Asian languages, which had long since been displaced by Persian, and in all these spheres, including Uzbek, including, you name it, all the languages, including the smallest language in the Caucasus, they were all given equal status, and in the next 7 years, all of them were given a script. So there was a way to adopt, and none of those languages are dying. They of course have, and now in Imperial Russia, of course, things have changed, but that's the subject of another talk. What is the reality in India? And that's why I'm going to come to, we should be welcoming the new education policy. Because this is the first time in an Indian policy document, the fact that there are so many languages in India, that they deserve to become languages of education is acknowledged. The last time it was done was apparently the Constitution, which gave all kinds of provision, which has led to the Indian state systematically counting down what India's linguistic diversity is. And so given this, so the idea that they will enter into an education system will take care of something that linguists, sociologists, everybody has been observing, that in schools are the major medium for language endangerment. So that is, this is a student of our center said this, and I think this is a very pithy formulation, because basically you can be living in Bengal's Totopara, which is the area of his work. You speak only Toto, your teachers are only Toto, right? At least the school helpers, but then everybody is supposed to be teaching in Bangla. So therefore you have huge dropout rates, you have a great feeling of saying, oh well, nobody wants me. Nobody wants me, and then you learn to forget your language and you learn connection. And there are masses of people who now appear saying, well, I am a Santhal, I am a Korokh, but I don't speak the language anymore, and I feel very bad. In fact, one interviewee in our said that, Bengali people can say they are from Bengal. Where do I say I come from? Aiyesha no longer lives in wherever she hails from. So therefore, language is identity. It is not something that you can develop, that can be used to communicate with other people ideas about the world. It is, I don't have that identity. And of course, Bengal or any other state in India carries many elisions within itself of all the Totos who live in Totopara but are forced to read Bangla. Okay. And so I think that the profusion of language names that we get is always a cry from the people that, well, count me, I'm different. Count me, I'm different, this is... So you would think that once you have a new education policy, that in a new education policy with this great, I mean, I think it uses the word language, God knows, in 2 chapters some 100 times, and it's very pious, and it would seem that this would be the way out, that we are now going to build multi-ethnic. But before I'll talk briefly about the provision of new education policy. I said, let's object of knowledge, not a matter of pure identity. Of course, I'm around it, but all of us must be able to understand and to be able to analyze languages. That's our innate ability. The other is I need to be able to plan. So we've lost 70 years. I need to be able to plan a language. So the language that I want to plan will have to be those very languages who have not got a script, who are not on the radio, who are not taught in schools. My effort must be to plan those very languages. It cannot be that I will plan, and which is what the new education policy does. So there's language all the time, and they say apparently that they only speak of it in terms of identity. So apparently we have the perfect languages, because you don't feel Indian, that apparently Indian languages are the only truly phonetic languages. And only, I don't know what it means, all languages, spoken languages are phonetic. They have the best rules, they have wealth of knowledge in them, words are like magic, they're just fantastic, much better than any other language. But there is not one word of planning. So they are not a subject of education and an object of education. So we would expect that the new education policy would tell us how it's going to plan these unplanned languages. The fact of the matter is, the ground realities for Indian languages is extremely dire, and they cannot be used for education straight away. There is no systematic graded pedagogical material, because when you have an English textbook or a Hindi textbook, in any of your subjects, you will find a list of difficult words, their meanings. You will find some explanation of grammar, that this is the way you say it. None of that. You don't actually, the reality is that most of these languages are not described even. And clearly, we cannot have a scheme by which you say less than 10,000 speaker languages don't count. Even languages which are spoken uniformly outside the age schedule don't have alphabet books. That is the reality. So that means you have to, any education policy that you would are going to get right from the helper is supposed to be able to speak all the languages in her class, and she's going to. And of course, for the minor languages, we get language helpers. So those basically we will employ other tribal people at 200 rupees per day, and we'll come and go to the speaker and say, okay, tick ho gaya, this is our language. This is not the way to plan language. Okay? And it even goes to say, which apparently should make us feel very good, even given this immense scarcity, that the medium of instruction, at least until grade 5, but preferably until grade 8, will be the home language, mother language, local language. Now the fact there's a home language, look at these categories. Home language, mother tongue, local language. Well, local language usually is the state's official language. So it's given you 3 slots. So it's the same scheme. Because I'm not developing these languages, and I am not developing. So the only thing the NEP document is really good for is the one to feed what I think is the nadir of the development of Indian languages. It is to feel pride. We have most unphonetic, we have languages that have best rules of grammar, best phonetics, best That's just the best. So feel really proud. Okay. So there is no national language policy, there is nothing to preserve. But it's also got no, so it's one thing about the students, but not even taking into account that every community in India is actually plural. So in a small village in Himachal, where we went on field work to do study Gaddi, the construction workers were from Nepal. And there were wonderful teachers in that school, so they used to just, without it being on the curriculum, they used to hold Gaddi classes for the Nepali children separately. But that's not built into policy. Okay? There is, at the policy level, there is no policy which says fund language studies. There is no policy which says fund linguistics department. There is no policy which says let us understand the number of languages there are in a district. There is no, and nobody is saying that you have to hire linguists to do that. People themselves are capable, and they are doing so, of describing their own languages, of trying to reduce them to writing. So that in a state like Tripura, where it's one of those rare states in India, and in deep contrast to Chhattisgarh, when Chhattisgarh was founded, there was all this who had the Chhattisgarhi is going to be the language. It's a very old language, spoken as a link language by all the communities there. But Chhattisgarhi never made the official language. But Kokborok did. And there is a resounding issue, even though it was the upper class, the ruling dispensation was primarily Bengali speaking. But what it did was make Kokborok. But what is happening to Kokborok development? Can you come and do a PhD in any central university with Kokborok? A PhD in Kokborok? You can't. So there is no investment, and all the schemes in the new education policy are just about making children guinea pigs, giving them non-formal education by helpers, putting the onus on the Anganwadi speaker, but there is no mention of what the role of departments of these languages in universities going to. So if a language is not going to get into the higher education system, the resources that you need to create. But finally, and there was something else I want to discuss, but maybe I could just take it up, that the NEP's persistent ignorance, that as if they are starting off with a clean slate, is that look at what the concrete proposals are. The child from class 1 to 5 is to be educated in home language, local language, or a Schedule 8 language. So suddenly the Schedule 8 language appears. And now, so that means if you take a language like Bangla, it is Schedule 8 language, and it is can be, of course, a home language, because everybody learns the language of the state. And it would be the local language also, because it's been had 75 years as being an independent language. And then Schedule 8 languages overlap with state languages. And the child has to learn plus 2 others. It also says that Hindi-speaking states must continue with Hindi and English. So all of you who today would be saying, I speak Bajjika, or I speak Baghi, or Bhojpuri, right, and proudly today, actually there's no way it's going to get into your education system. Because Hindi or English. Yeah. And the third language is going to be Sanskrit, which, and I'm quoting, to be offered at all levels of school and higher education as one of the optional languages. So we can have class 8-0, Anganwadi speakers also should be trained in Sanskrit. Everybody should be trained in Sanskrit, because Sanskrit is a perpetual option. Now, you notice that the speciousness, that to say that Sanskrit is a classical language, in Tamil Nadu you can't have Tamil. It's not the option of classical language that we apparently all have to learn classical languages, but no, only one classical level. Now, things get really bad. So, children can change from class 6 to 8, one of the 3 their languages is studying. and a fourth classical language can be taught for 2 years. Right? So if the child has already taken up Sanskrit, then she can take another classical language. But otherwise, if she didn't have Sanskrit, she will have to learn Sanskrit. So what happened to the Indian languages entering into the education system? Right? What makes one classical language so preeminent? And why is necessarily learning a classical language part of the three language formula? So, I mean, Tibetan is perhaps one of the most classical languages in Himachal Pradesh. It's a long written history and all the things, all the strictures. So supposing I am a child who who is growing up in Lahore, Spiti. Maybe I want to learn Hindi for the tourist trade. So supposing I have Spiti, Bhoti and Hindi, I can never have any question of me having Tibetan. But there is one final thing that I want to say to you. So there is, because I've been going on that there is no language policy along with this. And that final thing is that, well, the government listened to me, and in November 2021 has set up a Bharatiya Bhasha Samiti. And I'm going to just read some things from you. So the vast part of Indian society is multilingual, and their languages belong to the Bharatiya Bhasha Parivar. So now that we are in Amrit Kal and everything good is happening, apparently the most robust divisions between our languages, or those what the linguists call historical language families, that is to be disappeared. And the document actually asks, and I think we should organize one, because it will be fun, is to ask for proposals for making, to do the following. Let me just find that. It describes to you what Bharatiya Bhasha Parivar is. So during the colonial rule, because that is the only point of reference that people of these ideological foundations have, they have no critique of the Indian state that happened in the last 75 years, except this outsider Mussolini kind of thing. So during the colonial rule, several linguistic theories like Indo-European language family, etc., were floated in order to further the interests of the colonial rulers, but no explanation as to how it furthered their interests. Subsequently, Indian languages belong to one family, the Bharatiya Bhasha Parivar. Such findings were not allowed to be promoted for reasons best known to them. Now, with further research on this subject, to let the country know about it, and to read the other literature about this supposed bogey of the art. Those of you who know that there is a Sanghi Parivar is particularly adept at making, which led to the differentiation and the identification, which is important. So the anti-intellectual are the greatest. That idea is about to, and we should organize a seminar on this, because this is patently untrue. But it's also an attempt to remove this talk of linguistic diversity of many peopling India. That it wasn't just one group of people who peopled India, and that they have rights by virtue of their different ethnicities. So it's a somebody. And that is the task before us, which is why all my linguistic students must come to class. Because otherwise you were not going to get to learn the kind of linguistics you do for very much longer. Thank you. I'm sorry I've taken too long, but good audience.
Thank you. Thank you, Aiyesha. आपने मेरा काम काफ़ी हल्का कर दिया है, खास करके इतने बड़े दायरे में भाषा के सवाल को उसते हुए फिर मैं अपने वक्तव्य पर आऊँगा। कि मेरा बेटा, मेरी वाइफ भी स्कूल में पढ़ाती हैं और वो हिंदी और संस्कृत पढ़ाती हैं। तो उन्होंने कहा कि फॉरेन लैंग्वेज का ऑप्शन था, कहा कि देखो उसमें तुम्हें उतनी मदद नहीं मिलेगी और संस्कृत में मेरी मदद मिल जाएगी, इसलिए ले लो। मैंने काफ़ी पुश करने की कोशिश की कि फॉरेन लैंग्वेज पढ़ लो, एक थोड़ा बढ़िया रहेगा कि एक और लैंग्वेज सीखोगे, लेकिन फाइनली संस्कृत ही ऑप्ट हुआ। और वो 2 साल उसके कैसे गुजरे हैं ये मैं जानता हूँ, हाँ, कि कितनी मदद मिली और कितना उसका शोषण हुआ। सोच रहा हूँ कि जब ये अभी उसी स्कूल की टीचर काफ़ी, मेरी पत्नी बता रही थी कि इतनी तारीफ कर रही है कि एनईपी ने तो कल्याण कर दिया, दिस कर दिया, खास छोड़ के किसी और स्टेट के एक लैंग्वेज, शेड्यूल लैंग्वेज, हालांकि वो शेड्यूल लैंग्वेज ही है, लेकिन कम से कम शेड्यूल लैंग्वेज को पढ़ना उनको 2 साल, और फिर उस 2 साल के बाद उस स्टेट में उन बच्चों को भेजा जाता था। तो ये एक जो दूसरी भाषाओं के को सीखना और उनके साथ रहना, उनकी संस्कृति को जीना, ये जो इंक्लूसिव पॉलिसी थी, आज शायद उस पॉलिसी को आगे प्रमोट किया जाता तो इंडिया का जो एक एक्सक्लूजन पॉलिसी हो सकता था वो यही हो सकता था। लेकिन उससे अलग हम लोगों को गारंटी और दूसरा जो प्राउड फील करने का, गर्व महसूस करने का ये जो दौर है, इसमें संस्कृत की गारंटी है और गर्व करने का मौका है। तो ये कितना कुछ आगे बदलाव लाएगा ये समय बताएगा। लेकिन मैं जैसी बात कह रहा था कि ये कोई आज की देन नहीं है, और ख़ास करके आप देखें कि आयशा जिस चीज़ को बोल रही थी कि अवधि, हाँ, वो उर्दू किसी भी अवधी परिवार में नहीं बोली। उसी तरह से जो हिंदी, जिसको आज हम लोग हिंदी बोल रहे हैं और जिसको आज हम सब अपनी मातृभाषा के कॉलम में लिख रहे हैं कि हमारी मातृभाषा हिंदी है, मुझे कोई भी बता दे क्या उसके घरों में 1 पीढ़ी और 2 पीढ़ी पहले क्या ये हिंदी बोली जाती थी? और मैं दावे के साथ कह सकता हूं कि वो हिंदी थी ही नहीं। हम सबकी भाषा कोई और, या तो भोजपुरी है, मैथिली है, मगही है, और यहाँ तक की भाषा जिसका नाम भी हमें नहीं पता है, वो भाषाएं हैं जो हमारी मातृभाषा रही है। और इसीलिए उसको कई लोगों ने या तो भाषा कहा या देशिल बैना, हाँ, सब जन मिठा, वो जो विद्यापति कहते हैं, वो भी मैथिली उस रूप में नहीं बोलते, देसी भाषा। या तुलसीदास खुद ही जब अपनी अवधि में लिख रहे हैं रामचरितमानस, तो वो कह रहे कि मैं भाषा में लिख रहा हूँ। मतलब वो ये नहीं कह रहे कि मैं अवधि में या हिंदी में, या तो खैर जो हिंदी आज हम लोग बोल रहे हैं या जिस हिंदी की विश्वविद्यालय में पढ़ाई हो रही है, वो अगर हम देखें तो ये लेबोरेटरी में पैदा की हुई, और ख़ास करके अंग्रेज़ों की जो लेबोरेटरी थी जिसकी स्थापना फोर्ट विलियम कॉलेज में हुई थी, और वहीं पर उसी लेबोरेटरी का प्रोडक्ट है हिंदी और उर्दू। जहाँ पर कि आप लोग सब जो भी लिंग्विस्टिक्स के होंगे या हिंदी के लिटरेचर के होंगे, वो इस चीज़ को जानते हैं कि कैसे वहाँ पर आइडियल हिंदी कैसी होगी, उसका एक प्रारूप बनाया गया, एक ड्राफ्ट बनाया गया। लल्लू लाल जी, इंसाल्लाह खां, सदा सुखलाल जी, इन लोगों को भर्ती ही की गई थी कि वो उर्दू और हिंदी में फ़र्क कैसे करें, कि अरबी फारसी से मिक्स करके जो एक लैंग्वेज निकाला, उसको उर्दू का नाम दिया और उसकी स्क्रिप्ट फारसी की गई, और ठीक इसी तरह से संस्कृत निष्ठ बना के और उसको नागरी में लिखने की पद्धति जो शुरू हुई, उसी का नाम हिंदी रखा गया। और वो जो लेबोरेटरी थी, उसी लेबोरेटरी को आगे कंटिन्यू करने में एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट रोल रहा नागरी प्रचारणी सभा का, और उस चीज़ को हमें समझना जरूरी है, क्योंकि वहीं से हिस्ट्री राइटिंग का एक पूरा प्रोजेक्ट आता है। और चूंकि अब आप जानते होंगे कि जो शुरुआत में सांप्रदायिक दंगे 1857 के बाद अंग्रेजों ने जिसको फूट डालो राज करो, तो उसमें दो चीज का बड़ा उपयोग किया है। एक स्क्रिप्ट का कि नागरी होगा या फारसी लिपि होगी, और दूसरा गोरक्षा। और आज हम दोनों जो यहाँ आज हम बैठे हुए हैं उसको आप जब तक वहां से नहीं देखेंगे तो चीजें आपको लगेगा कि ये 10 साल की देन है, ऐसा नहीं है। और वहां आप पाएंगे कि बड़े ही सिस्टमेटिक तरीके से, क्योंकि उन्हें रूलिंग क्लास उस समय मुसलमान शासक थे और उनकी जो भाषा थी ऑफिशियल लैंग्वेज था, उसको वो दरकिनार करके और ऑल्टरनेट करके एक हिंदू और हिंदी और हिंदुस्तान की आइडेंटिटी बनाने की जो कोशिश है, जिसको हम खास करके जो 1980-85 के बाद के दौर में ये स्लोगन के रूप में भी आया कि हिंदी हिंदू हिंदुस्तान। और उसी स्लोगन के तहत अब था कि अगर हिंदी होगी और उसका नागरी लिपि होगी तो भाई कोई डिक्शनरी तो हो जिसमें कि इस तरीके से लिखा जाए। और नागरी प्रचारणी सभा एक तरफ इस लिपि को आगे बढ़ाने में भूमिका निभाया, और साथ ही उसने एक प्रोजेक्ट लिया जिसको इतिहास लेखन कह लीजिए या शब्दकोश बनाने का। उसी शब्दकोश की भूमिका जो लिखी वो रामचंद्र शुक्ल ने, उसको ही आज हम लोग जानते हैं हिंदी साहित्य का इतिहास बोला जाता है। और आप उस इतिहास को अगर पढ़ेंगे तो उस पूरे प्रोजेक्ट को आप समझ सकते हैं, बहुत स्पष्ट रूप में समझ सकते हैं। जैसे फॉर एग्जाम्पल मैं 2-3 बातें कहूंगा। हालांकि ये भी एक सच है कि रामचंद्र शुक्ल के उस आइकॉन बनाने का जो प्रयास था उसको मजबूत करने का अगर जो प्रयास हुआ, उसमें एक हमारा सेंटर भी, आपका सेंटर भी है उसमें से एक, जिसने उसको चाहे उसमें प्रोग्रेसिव मार्क्सिस्ट हिंदी वाले जो साथी रहे हैं, चाहे वो नामर सिंह के रूप में हो, चाहे वो विश्वनाथ त्रिपाठी के रूप में हो, या और भी रामविलास शर्मा हो, इन सब ने एक तरह से उसको उस आइकॉन जो बनाया था एक उसी को कंटिन्यू किया। और वो आज हम सबके ऊपर एक भारी एक बोझ की तरह से है कि अब आप किस तरह से उसको उतार के एक नया इतिहास लेखन कर सकें। और ये चुनौती आज है हमारे पास। आप ध्यान से देखिए कि वो इतिहास के दौरान किसको वो हिंदी मानते हैं और किसको हिंदी नहीं मानते हैं। और तब आप पाएंगे कि जैसे ही वो खास करके जिसको वो भक्ति काल कहते हैं, उस भक्ति काल में आप जाएंगे तो पाएंगे कि जैन साहित्य, बौद्ध साहित्य, इस तरह के जितने भी साहित्य है उन सबको वो धार्मिक साहित्य का नाम देके उसको दरकिनार कहते कि ये लिटरेचर नहीं है, ये धार्मिक ग्रंथ है। लेकिन दूसरी तरफ पूरा का पूरा जो वैष्णव साहित्य है, चाहे वो आप सूरदास के रूप में लें, तुलसीदास के रूप में लें, ये सबको भक्ति आंदोलन के दायरे में लिया। और मजेदार ये है कि भाषा का जब सवाल आया तो कबीर दास की भाषा को कहा कि ये तो गाली गलौज की भाषा है, इसको तो एक्सक्लूड करने की जरूरत है, ये इंक्लूड करने की जरूरत नहीं है। तो एक बड़े ही सिस्टमेटिक तरीके से जहां मुसलमानों को ऐड भी किया, खास करके अगर देखिए जैसे रहीम तो उनको ऐड करते हैं, या रसखान इनको कहते हैं कि ये मुसलमान होकर भी इन्होंने हिंदू दिल पाया है। तो क्योंकि इन्होंने वैष्णव भक्ति का के आधार पर गीत गाए। ये एक सच है कि कम्युनिटी, एक कम्युनिटी जो लैंग्वेज बेस्ड कम्युनिटी में बोल रहा हूँ, वो रिलीजन बेस्ड कम्युनिटी की बात नहीं कर रहा हूँ, एक जो लैंग्वेज बेस्ड कम्युनिटी होगा उसकी एक अपनी संस्कृति होगी, उसका एक अपना कल्चर होगा। और आप इसीलिए देखेंगे कि इस रीजन में जैसा चाहे वो मुस्लिम हो चाहे वो हिंदू हो, संगीत में आप देखेंगे कि ज्यादातर शास्त्रीय संगीतों में कृष्ण राधा ये सब आते हैं। और इसी तरह से मूर्ति कला में भी, चाहे हिंदू हो मुसलमान हो, एक कल्चरल जो इस कम्युनिटी का है वो उभर कर आता है। लेकिन जब उसी का आप इतिहास लेखन करते हैं तो इंक्लूजन और एक्सक्लूजन का जो आप पैरामीटर सेट करते हैं, यहीं से आप भाषा का सांप्रदायिकरण करना एक तरह से शुरू करते हैं। और ये सांप्रदायिकरण, इसलिए आज मैं बहुत कठोर रूप में बोल रहा हूं, लेकिन ये एक फैक्ट है कि हम जब आज पढ़ें, तुलसीदास को आप पढ़िए और गालिब को आप पढ़िए, कौन सी भाषा आपको अपने ज्यादा करीब लगती है? बिहारी आप पढ़ें या घनानंद पढ़ें और उसी के आसपास के तमाम उर्दू शायर को आप पढ़ें, जिसको उर्दू साहित्य कहा जाता है, तो आपको लगेगा कि आज की जो बोलचाल की भाषा है, मैं इसीलिए बोल रहा हूं कि आज जब आप इस हिंदी को बना रहे हैं कि यही हिंदी असली हिंदी है, तो उसके भी करीब कौन सी भाषा आपको दिखाई देती है? तो ये एक बड़े ही तरीके से आप पाएंगे कि उस भाषा के साहित्य के इतिहास लेखन के दौरान जो एक सांप्रदायिकरण की कोशिश शुरू हुई और वो कोशिश आगे भी बढ़ती चली गई। आप उर्दू में बोले मैं जाता हूं तो कैसे बोलेंगे? मैं जाता हूं। लेकिन उसी को आपने फारसी में लिख दिया तो कहेंगे कि ये उर्दू होगी। तो ये जिसका इस भाषा को एक तरह से धर्म से जोड़ने का जो अंग्रेजों की कोशिश थी, क्योंकि उनको एक ऐसी सोसाइटी चाहिए थी जो बटी हुई सोसाइटी हो, जिसमें किसी भी तरह की एकता अगर स्थापित होती है तो वो उनकी सत्ता को चुनौती देगा। आज क्या हम उसी स्थिति को नहीं पाते हैं? और तब आप ध्यान कीजिए कि जिस नेशनलिज्म को, खास करके ये जो स्लोगन है हिंदी हिंदू हिंदुस्तान, ये हमारे नेशनलिज्म को रिप्रेजेंट नहीं करता, हमारे राष्ट्रवाद को रिप्रेजेंट नहीं करता। ये यूरोप के, खास करके वेस्ट यूरोप के जो नेशनलिज्म है उसको रिप्रेजेंट करता है। कैसे? तो एक भाषा और एक राष्ट्र, खास करके वहां आप देखेंगे कि जब राष्ट्र बनने की प्रक्रिया होती है तो उसमें जो कम्युनिटी का एक कॉन्सेप्ट है वो लिंग्विस्टिक बेस होगा। एक जिसको स्टालिन की भाषा में अगर मैं कहूं तो साझा जीवन, साझा व्यापार, साझी भाषा और साझा जो भावनात्मक संबंध, ये जो एक भावनात्मक संबंध है वहीं से वो जातीयता या एथनिसिटी, राष्ट्रीयता के रूप में बनती है। ये जिसको यूरोप में एक भाषा एक राष्ट्र का जो स्ट्रक्चर आया, कहीं ना कहीं उस समय जो बन रही राष्ट्रीयता भारत में भी थी, उसमें एक खास सोच के लोगों ने, उस समय मैं नहीं कह सकता हूं कि वो हिंदुत्ववादी सोच के ही थे, क्योंकि उस समय वो एक आइडियोलॉजी के तौर पर बना भी नहीं था जब ये स्लोगन दिया गया था। तो प्रभाव जो आया होगा वो वेस्ट के उस राष्ट्रवाद से ही आया होगा, जहां उन्होंने एक भाषा एक राष्ट्र का कॉन्सेप्ट लिया। लेकिन उसका इस्तेमाल आगे चल के, खास करके 20वीं शताब्दी के आरंभ में जब जनसंघ की स्थापना होती है, उसके बाद दो राष्ट्र का सिद्धांत, तो हम देख रहे हैं कि आप पाकिस्तान देखिए जो बना वो क्या है, उर्दू मुस्लिम पाकिस्तान, और जो क्षेत्र पाकिस्तान का है वो उसको थोड़ा सा आइडेंटिफाई कीजिए, वहां कौन सी भाषा बोली जा रही है? तो पंजाबी है, सिंधी है, बलूचिस्तानी है, बंगला है, लेकिन कहीं भी हिंदी नहीं है। और उसकी राष्ट्रभाषा क्या है? तो उर्दू, क्योंकि उर्दू बोलने वाले वहां कहीं नहीं। और यही कारण है कि आगे चल के उस बांग्ला राष्ट्रीयता के साथ जो एक कॉन्ट्रडिक्शन उभरता है, वो उस राष्ट्र को तोड़ता है। तो आज हमें ये बहुत गंभीरता से समझने की जरूरत है कि जब हम आज भाषा और राष्ट्रीयता के सवाल को देख रहे हैं तो कैसी पॉलिसी हमें चाहिए। क्या वो पॉलिसी चाहिए जिसमें पाकिस्तान जैसा विभाजन हो जाए कि जहां विभिन्न राष्ट्रीयताएं एक साथ मौजूद हैं भारत में, जहां तमिल से लेके और कश्मीर तक, और फिर त्रिपुरा के मतलब से लेके मिजोरम से लेके आप देखें गुजरात तक इतनी राष्ट्रीयताएं हैं, जिसको अभी कांग्रेस ने काफी बड़े विस्तार से रखने की कोशिश की कि इतनी राष्ट्रीयताओं में अगर हम इसी रूप में थोपने की कोशिश करेंगे, एक राष्ट्रीयता को थोपने की कोशिश करेंगे, चाहे वो संस्कृत के नाम पर करें चाहे वो हिंदी के नाम पर करें, उसका परिणाम दूसरी राष्ट्रीयताओं में असंतोष के रूप में उभरना है। और इसके साथ ही दूसरा जो संकट है वो संकट है कि हम जो एक दूसरे से, खास करके आज हमारा 75वां साल, हम अमृत काल जिसको कहा, कि इस अमृत काल में तो जरूरत यह है कि 75 साल का एक पूरा इतिहास हमारे साथ है, एक साझा जीवन का एक इतिहास है, पॉलिटिक्स के तौर पर, कल्चर के तौर पर, हर चीज पर एक हम आगे बढ़े हैं, इसमें कोई शक नहीं है। इंक्लूसिव भी काफी कुछ हुआ है, जेएनयू एक उसी इंक्लूसिव कल्चर का एक नमूना है। लेकिन उसी इंक्लूसिव और उसमें जब मैं आज आ रहा था तो मुझे एक खास तरह का प्रिंटेड मटेरियल पूरे कैंपस में, ये मैं पहली बार इस कैंपस के अंदर मैंने देखा, प्रिंटेड मटेरियल इतने बड़े पैमाने पर इससे पहले मैंने नहीं देखा था, और एक खास रंग के जरिए। तो ये जो इंक्लूजन है, जो जेएनयू जैसी संस्था जो इंक्लूसिव रही है, चाहे वो एडमिशन की पॉलिसी हो, चाहे वो लैंग्वेज की पॉलिसी रही हो, चाहे वो जो यहाँ एक कैंपस कल्चर को डेवलप करते हुए दूसरी भाषाओं के साथियों को जोड़ने की, कि यहीं पर मैंने देखा कि बत्तीलाल बैरवा जैसे हमारे साथी जो है वो स्टूडेंट यूनियन के लीडर भी हुए, जो राजस्थान से बिल्कुल, जिनको अंग्रेजी नहीं आती थी और दूसरी भाषा, और उनको कैसे साथियों ने यहाँ बढ़ाया, और भी तमाम लोग रहे हैं। मैं उनकी बात करते हुए यही कहना चाहूंगा कि ये जो इंक्लूसिव नेचर है वही राष्ट्रीयता का हमारा स्वरूप हो सकता है। दुर्भाग्य से, जैसा मैंने कहा कि इससे पहले जब नवोदय का कंसेप्ट था फिर भी उसमें वो इंक्लूसिवनेस था। ये और बात है कि तमाम और भी कितना भी आप करें, क्योंकि भारत जैसे डाइवर्सिटी में शेड्यूल्ड करके जो आप लैंग्वेज पॉलिसी लाएंगे तब भी बहुत सारी भाषाएं उसमें भी दबेंगी, नो डाउट। लेकिन फिर भी एक कोशिश जो हो सकती थी कि हम उन राष्ट्रीयताओं के बीच में एक आपसी रिश्ता बना सकते थे, वो भी आज इस दौर में खत्म होता हुआ दिखाई दे रहा है। और हम जैसे लोगों को दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय में आज के डेट में मैं आने से पहले वही चर्चा कर रहा था कि एईसी जैसे पेपर जो आपकी एबिलिटी एनहेंसमेंट कोर्स के नाम पर लाया गया है, और सभी स्टूडेंट्स को उसको पढ़ने के लिए मस्ट कर दिया गया कि सबको पढ़ना होगा एईसी का पेपर, और वो हिंदी होगा, इंग्लिश को हटा के उसको हिंदी किया गया। तो हिंदी वालों में एक खुशी हुई कि हमारा वर्कलोड बढ़ जाएगा, लेकिन पढ़ा क्या रहे हैं हम? पढ़ा ये रहे हैं कि पैराग्राफ राइटिंग, लेटर एक लिखिए, जो आज के डेट में कोई नहीं लिखता, माँ बाप को लेटर, ना ही अपने दोस्तों को, ना ही बैंक में, सबके आप हिंदी में ये लेटर लिखिए, ये ऐसे पैसेज लिखिए, सार संक्षेप लिखिए, जो 8वीं 9वीं 10वीं क्लास में ऑलरेडी स्टूडेंट पढ़ चुका है, उसी को यहाँ लाया जा रहा है। तो आप देखेंगे, पाएंगे कि कैसे शिक्षण संस्थानों को इस गर्वबोध के साथ उभार के और उस पूरी की पूरी शिक्षा को ही खत्म करने का, उसकी गंभीरता को खत्म करने का, और जो नियुक्ति की प्रक्रिया है उसके बारे में अब मैं बोलना भी बंद कर दिया हूं कि शायद वही प्रक्रिया है कि आप क्वालिटी से कॉम्प्रोमाइज जब शिक्षकों की भर्ती में करते हैं, तो वही कॉम्प्रोमाइज आपको अंततः अपने सिलेबस में भी करना पड़ता है, क्योंकि उसको पढ़ाने की जो कॉम्पिटेंसी है उसका भी एक प्रॉब्लम है। तो आज हम एक इनकॉम्पिटेंट एरा में जी रहे हैं। एक गर्व के नाम पर हमारी जो नॉलेज इकोनॉमी में जो इंडिया का एक बहुत बड़ा रोल था, 10 साल के बाद कोई भी पॉलिसी आती है तो उसका परिणाम तुरंत नहीं मिलता है, थोड़े दिनों के बाद मिलता है। हम जैसे जो शिक्षक हैं जिन्होंने एक अच्छे दिन देखे थे, वो आज समझ रहे हैं कि 10 साल के बाद इस इकोनॉमी जो हम वर्ल्ड लेवल पर एक नॉलेज इकोनॉमी के तौर पर थे, वो किस रूप में होंगे, वी डोंट नो। हमारी स्थिति आज ये हो रही है कि जहाँ एक डिटोरिएशन है लैंग्वेज के लेवल पर भी। हम सबकी कोशिश होनी चाहिए कि हम कैसे इसको इंक्लूसिव बनाएं, इस कैंपस को इंक्लूसिव बनाएं, हमारी पॉलिटिक्स भी इंक्लूसिव हो, ये हमारी कोशिश होनी चाहिए। जब तक ऊपर नहीं बदलेगा, नीचे नहीं बदलेगा, तो हम सब नीचे जो हैं वो ऊपर की कोशिश करते रहें, ताकि एक इंक्लूसिव पॉलिटिक्स भी हमारे समझ में आए और हम उस ओर बढ़ें। थैंक यू, मुझे बुलाने के लिए आप सबका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
थैंक यू सो मच सर एंड मैम। आई होप कि